Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park. And today we bring you Read 3 of Where I Belong by Sujin Lee and Linda Yoon. And we are continuing to work through our traumas. We're discovering a little bit more about the mental healing aspect of our lives. But recently, I think a lot of us have been going through, I don't know, there's 4 different viruses out there from what I've read. There's one for the stomach, there's a couple of flu variants and things like that. So I think a lot of people are going through it. I think a lot of people are feeling sick, or at least for short periods of time, hopefully, just feeling a little bit ill. But I kind of want to talk about, and this is something I think we've talked about a little bit in the past, but talk about what our healing rituals are.
Mm.
Because right now I'm feeling something that's kind of been in my stomach for a while, and it's something where it magnifies some of the digestive issues that I have. So it really puts me out for several days, if not a couple of weeks. And usually, any kind of stomach issues that I have, I tend to default to something I used to get as a kid. I don't know how many other people know about this thing, but it's this orange bottle, and there's a logo that kind of looks like a bugle or a trumpet.
Mm-hmm.
The actual name of the bottle, because I looked for it for a long time not knowing what the name was, but the name is Saragan, which that's not what I grew up like. My mom would always call it Chongnoan, which I honestly have no idea what that means. I don't know if it's the name of a medication or the name of something that is similar kind of
Mm.
thing. But that's the thing that I always got. It's a mixture of things that I don't really know well. It's supposed to just regulate the digestive system and help put it back to normal. But I was wondering if you had anything similar. Like if you had any go-to things where if your stomach or your head or something kind of felt like it flared up, what your parents would have you do, or things that you've done that you've carried over from your parents.
So something that my parents would always do when we're sick was to cover us in Vicks.
Mm-hmm.
And although I don't have Vicks now, I now realize that it's eucalyptus, and the reason why I'm drawn to yoga studios is because of the scent of
Mm-hmm.
eucalyptus. So that's why I carry eucalyptus incense. Like when I feel sick or when I'm feeling down and depressed, that's when I burn the incense, especially when I'm showering, so that the scent would permeate the space.
And do you feel like it's something that's more mental or physical or a little bit of both?
I think it's a little bit of both. Our minds are very powerful. So when I feel good, that's when my body starts to get better, or at least it feels like I'm getting better.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like Vicks is definitely a staple in your household.
Yes.
I feel like it's also a staple in probably a lot of not only Filipino households, but I know kind of some other cultures also carry over this theme.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where it came from. There's probably an interesting history of why there's such strong belief that Vicks will heal everything,
Right.
but it's definitely there. I'm also wondering though if there's anything beyond that that's more homeopathic. Like I remember when I had headaches, my grandma would dampen a rag and like make sure it's cold, and I think that's just to lower body temperature. I don't think that's just an Eastern medicine or anything like that, but that's not stuff that I've carried over. For some reason, I very specifically want to keep this very particular stomach medicine. It's not even medicine. I think it's just a probiotic or some kind of digestive assistance kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something I've carried over to every single time I feel sick. This is my go-to in trying to feel better.
For sure.
And it tastes so bad. It tastes so awful.
Yeah, it's very potent.
But it makes me get better, whether mentally, psychologically, or physically. It seems to always work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if anyone else has their own life hacks or the stuff that their parents have given them, whether it's a very particular medication or product, or if it's just something that you do, like you wrap yourself in a blanket or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But we're here to talk a little bit more about mental healing as we're reading the book. But before we do that, let's go into talking about our recommendation for the week.
Our recommendation for the week is not Kyra's looks. Kyra is a creative who expresses her art through makeup. The makeup looks she produces can be described as inventive, striking, and emotive, marked by flawless blending and satisfying color palettes. You can learn more about Kyra through her Linktree at linktree/NotKyrasLooks and on Instagram at NotKyrasLooks, and that's NOTKYRAS looks.
Yep, and that's going to be our recommendation for the week. Okay, so we're on read 3 of 4 of Where I Belong by Sujin Lee and Linda Yoon. On this read, we've read pages 151 through 230, which were chapter 7, Cultivating Self-Compassion, through chapter 9, Embracing Our Intersectional Identities. Up to this point, what have we talked about?
Up to this point, we've talked about the homeostasis and window of tolerance. We've talked about intergenerational trauma and our trauma responses, such as fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And we also talked about the distinctions among shame, guilt, and grief.
Yeah, and in this read, we're going to start off our discussion with a little talk about compassion. Because after we go through all of those things, it's important to also realize that the stuff that stacks on top of us isn't necessarily the stuff that we need to always carry and burden, which I think that leads into maybe just one plane of what compassion is. But let's talk about what Linda and Sujin think.
So, Linda and Sujin define compassion as a recognition that we all experience joy, sorrow, struggle, and triumph. In a way, it's acknowledging our humanity.
Mhm.
And with this, it also allows us to nurture interconnectedness when we have compassion towards others. And it also allows us to nurture interconnectedness, empathy, and kindness towards each other. But just like the chapter says, it's not just about compassion towards others, it's also compassion towards ourselves.
Yeah, because one thing we do to ourselves is self blame.
Mm-hmm.
It's something we learn usually from childhood.
Mm-hmm.
It's the experiences that keep stacking on top of you that tell you that your grade wasn't good enough, that the work that you did wasn't up to par, the cleaning that you did wasn't clean enough for what it should be. So it's things that you learn that I think the way it's meant to be portrayed is to try to make you better, but it
Mm-hmm.
comes off as developing our own self guilt and our self blame.
Right. And it also starts going into the territory of shame.
Yeah.
When it comes to compassion, how do you feel like you show it to yourself?
I think I'm one that doesn't do well with self compassion. I think it's much easier for me to give that to others. It's within the practice of what I do for work, it's what I've grown up doing.
Mm,
Just always trying my best to think about others. And it's not saying that that part's perfect either, because there's definitely moments where I don't feel compassionate about people, but I do feel like the turnaround of being able to give to others is much easier than to give to myself.
that makes sense. I feel like I grew up with that same mentality that I should consider others' feelings and consider other people before myself. But when I think about self compassion, I think about self talk. When I do something I don't like, or when I do something that's wrong, quote unquote, or a mistake, I talk to myself as if I'm talking to a friend, like, it's okay, you're only human, or we all make mistakes, or it's perfectly okay to be imperfect.
That's interesting because I would say I do the same thing where I do self talk, but it's usually in a more negative way. It's much more along the lines of, you could have done that a little bit better. You should try to do this, or you could spend more time doing this. Like, this should be adjusted this way. Like, it's all ways that I could ideally make something a little bit better,
Mhm.
which I don't know if that's something like if someone were to be able to come up to me, like if a genie came up to me and asked me, I can take this part away from you where you don't have this self blame, or I can give you better compassion for yourself or something. Like, I don't know if I really would fully want that. I think the
Mm,
drive for myself and how I've gotten to the place where I currently am happened because of the fact that I was able to be hard on myself.
mm,
So it's scary to think that there is a possibility of not having that same drive because I don't have that same guilt. But at the same time, I understand that that guilt isn't necessary to have that drive.
right, because you can always use affirmations instead of guilt.
But I didn't grow up with affirmations, and I feel like a lot of people didn't grow up with affirmations. So I think that's the scary part is like you're entering a whole new space of trying to navigate your life in a manner that you've never done before. So it's like entering a new pathway that you really can't see clearly what it looks like.
For sure. I mean, I get where you're coming from. I also didn't grow up with affirmations, and I grew up with guilt and shame as my way of pushing myself forward. But what's interesting is that the change in self talk started coming from my college years. Like when I went through psychology classes and when I went through my nursing classes, one of the things that they reminded us continuously is change the tape. And for those of you who are Gen Zers, tapes are those things that you put into a boombox in order to play music back in the day.
Yeah, it's change the track, change the song. I mean, there are different variations of it.
Yes.
But it also feels like such a white thing. Like it feels like not a part of who I am.
That's fair.
Like I think if I saw a lot more Asian people being able to not be hard on themselves, and I guess not just Asian people, but successful Asian people,
Hmm.
I think that would make it so that it feels more reassuring to enter that space. But based off of the historical difficulties that we've had to overcome, people that we see that are usually Asian or people of color or minorities that have made their way to more successful positions
Hmm.
usually don't stumble on there the same way that white people do. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of putting yourself in the right places. So I think that's what draws in my mind as how to become successful is you really do have to, or at least this is what I believe is you really do have to put yourself into overdrive and maybe be a little bit mean enough to yourself that it puts you in uncomfortable positions so that you can move forward and
Mm,
you want to move forward.
that's fair. Which kind of brings us to what Sujin and Linda mention in the book, which is that every demand of our inner critic is a result of an unmet need or pain we carry within us, just like generational trauma, just like our cultural traumas.
Yeah, and I think they even go further into that. So they talk about the migration stories that our parents or our grandparents or whoever moved to the country that you're in have developed. And
Mhm.
it's the story that usually comes with some variation of pain and trauma. Especially at that time, it wasn't easy to take yourself away from your home country, try to go to a place where you didn't speak the language, try to restart a life in a place that people look down upon you.
Mhm.
Like there was a lot of pain and trauma there. But I think the thing that I really liked that they had discussed was the opposite of that, where because they moved here, because they had all these mountains to climb, there is a certain strength that your ancestors have developed so that they can manage and thrive in this new community or these new spaces or be able to carry on the legacy by putting in the work and the strength that it took.
Right. And it's not just individual strength, but as more of our people migrate, as more of our people congregate in a particular area like Los Angeles, like Guam, then there's that collective strength too that's built within the community.
hmm The words that they use are affirmative strength. It's the realization that it's not just traumas that are passed down, but it is the strengths that are also ancestral and, in a way, hereditary.
Yeah. What kinds of strengths do you feel like you've gained from your heritage?
I think with the Korean people and the fortitude that's needed to develop to come out of the amount of war traumas that have been and still currently are in place, I think there's an inner fight in me that I just can't quite explain. There's a doggedness, or there's a piece of me that's willing to fight through almost any instance if that need is there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's just a personal thing that I grew up with. I think that's just something where it's been inputted into my system. And the closest explanation would be this ancestral type of strength.
For sure. When I think about Filipino Filipinx people, I think of resistance and I think of resilience. With the current administration, both in the US and the Philippines, things are not looking great. And because of the relationship between the administrations, the current outlook for the people in the Philippines seems like it's not going to be for them. It's going to be for those who are rich, for those who are in the military, for those who are in cahoots with the corrupt leaders. So, with that, there is this fight within us to speak up against the wrongs, to speak up against things that are not for the people, which is kind of why I feel the same want to fight against injustices, that resistance. And the resilience part is that even though there are traumas, even though there was a war that wiped out millions of Filipinos and Filipinx folks, there is still this positivity and this joy that can't be taken away from them.
I was going to say, I think when I look at it from an outsider perspective, the ancestral strength within the Philippine people seems to be from community.
Mhm.
I think that was always a draw from the outside. It was something that I think I've talked about once, but the ability for people who are Filipino to form families and relationships, and then the community families, it's pretty extraordinary. It's this ability to create spaces and create homes where there might not be one based off just blood alone.
Yeah.
I mean, Philippine people were some of the first to migrate to the United States or to Mexico.
Mhm.
We see a lot of places where Filipino people, because of whether jobs, finances, space, different reasons for emigrating outside of the Philippines, they still find their own spaces and pockets where they can create a home. And I feel like that is something that is carried over from the ability of the ancestors to always be able to create what is needed when it may not be available.
For sure. It kind of reminds me of my personal experience that anytime I notice someone's Filipino, I automatically gravitate toward them. And it also reminds me of Jokoy's joke about his mom always being like, Filipino?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's kind of how we create community is by finding each other.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's different for other cultures. Like, I get excited when I see another Korean person, especially in Portland,
Mhm.
but I think if it's in Los Angeles or somewhere else where you see a larger Korean population, there's not that same connectivity.
Mm.
It's kind of like a head nod, it's an acknowledgement, but it's not that same feeling that you want to gather.
Mm.
Whereas we've talked about your experiences when you were growing up in Guam, and I remember saying that I wanted to go to a place where there was a really good barbecue or hangout or a gathering, and you're like, "Oh yeah, we could just go to one." And I was like, do we need to know the person?" You're like, "No, we'll know somebody there.
Yeah.
Like somebody knows somebody that knows somebody, and we can just go get food." And I
Hmm.
was like, "That's I think what is the carryover of that closeness or that ability to create closeness."
Totally. Something that I observe about the Korean community is that they gravitate towards churches or religious affiliations in order to create community.
It's trying to find a place where you can feel involved or you can create a certain forming of a bond.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of leads us into what we want to talk about next, which is intersectionality. Because along with going to a church, it then defines you as someone who's religious of a certain branch of whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I grew up as a Korean Christian. I also identify as a male. I also identify as someone who is athletic. And there are so many different circles in the Venn diagram that would make me who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was kind of the topic point of what we saw from this book in terms of intersectionality.
Mm-hmm. In addition, with intersectionality, it kind of reminds us not only of where our identities intersect with other identities, but it also shows us privilege as well. For example, something that hit home and made it feel like I was physically punched was the intersection of racism and sexism among Asian women, and how there is this stereotype of Asian women being exotic, docile, and non confrontational. And that's why I hate the word exotic, because that word has been tossed around so many times among Asian women, particularly as a Filipinx person. That word makes me sick.
Mm-hmm.
It's just gross.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it comes from a deep-rooted history in militarization. It comes from how our countries needed to survive in a sense. I mean, I don't think our countries are where they are, sadly, without that piece of the history that's there.
Yeah.
But it then carries over into who we are, where we now carry the burdens of our past. And yeah, being an Asian woman means that there is a lot of sexualization just based off of the history and what's been seen through years of media and the public perception of who that group of people are.
Yeah.
Then it can even go into different parts of what makes an individual an individual. So
Mm-hmm.
intersectionality is very personal, it's very complex,
Yes.
but it does develop more of who you are more than just an Asian American.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the biggest point that they were trying to make is you may feel like you're in this bubble of people just because you carry these characteristics and traits that are defined for you by what this general perception is.
Mm.
Because as a person, you are much more than what those two little blips of your identity might be.
Mm. But they're not just two little blips. They can be very essential to a person's experience and lens of living.
Yeah, and I guess I meant two little blips when we look at the map of who everyone is.
Mm.
Like Asian and woman and Asian American
Mm-hmm.
are probably three very strong distinguishing characteristics of people who identify as those three characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you add on all the other bubbles of who you are, then you kind of have to zoom out and say like, oh, the bigger picture is this. So I guess that's more of what I meant is it's not three little bubbles, it's just that there's so much there to what makes a human
Right.
that if someone designates you as an Asian youth, then that's not all that you are.
Right, definitely. And that kind of brings us full circle into the compassion element, in that when we view people in a compassionate sense, we're seeing them as their whole self rather than as just Asian, rather than just as femme or women, or rather than just a person from the United States.
Right. This read seemed to focus a little bit more on the introspective,
Hmm.
the looking within rather than looking around. And it felt nice to start to look into compassion and look into self identity after we've looked at all of the other stuff that maybe built up our more traumatic parts of who we identified as.
Yeah, definitely. This section focused more on the person themselves rather than their ancestors or their heritage by themselves.
Yeah. And based on the titles, it looks like the next two and the last two chapters are going to also be more celebratory, kind
Mm.
of coming out of the muck of everything that we've seen that might be holding us down.
Yeah.
But for us to get there, we need to know what we're reading. And so, what will we be reading for our fourth read?
For our fourth read, we will be reading pages 231 through 299, and that'll be chapter 10, Reclaiming Our Community, chapter 11, Celebrating Our Stories, and the final thoughts.
Yep. And for anyone that wants to reach out to us, and maybe you have a book that you really found connected with you or your identity, how can people reach out to us?
Y'all can reach out to us through email at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com or through Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
We also have our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com, where we have books that we've read in the past, books that we recommend, and books that we plan to read in the future.
And a great way to support us is to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast.
Otherwise, make sure to be happy, be healthy, and read a book.
Ingat! Bye!